Welcome back, everybody. We have spent a lot of time in the last 3 days talking about attitudes and policy, but now we're going to talk a little bit about electoral politics as we consider Decision 2024, the races, the faces, and the places that will decide. How about that? The races, the places, and the faces that will decide this year's election. And we have two great friends of one country and great folks to help us analyze it and break it down. Tim Miller is Buckward's uh, writer at large and the author of the best-selling book, Why We Did It, a travelogue from the Republican Road to Hell. He has previously served as a senior advisor to the anti-Trump Our Principles PAC, and communication director for Jeb Bush's 2016 presidential campaign, and the spokesperson for the Republican National Committee. Tom Bonier is a veteran Democratic political strategist, speaks slowly, and CEO of the leading political data solutions provider, TargetSmart. He spent over 20 years working in Democratic and progressive politics in all campaigns in all 50 states, as well as several countries overseas. As a consultant, Tom has worked directly for hundreds of campaigns, including Cory Booker, Elizabeth Warren, John Tester, and Tim Kaine, as well as President Obama's 2008 campaign. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And I know that everybody is watching because, the people who are probably listening to this podcast are thinking about the election, thinking about what's that going to look like. But before we do that, I think people are confused by polls. Just like every other institution is being questioned, the idea that polling is correct or not correct, it's always correct if it shows you ahead, right? And incorrect if you're down. But politicians pay attention to polls, and when they say, "Oh, the only poll that matters is election day," that's not true. Um, they care about polling. So I think maybe start with you, Tom. Can you explain a little bit about how polls are done and why you have to be really careful in this day where people don't have landlines? They aren't easily identified. They don't answer their phone. How difficult has that made accuracy in polling going into this election cycle?
Yeah. And first of all, I'm excited to be here with y'all. And I'm super excited to talk about polling. It's one of my favorite things. And I'm going to try not to bore people. I'll give the quick answer because I know we'll have lots of time to dig in more. But best example I can give of this, just in terms of how difficult polling has gotten and why we need to sort of take the results in context with a little bit of grain of salt, is not that long ago. If you go back like 20 years ago and you look at like Pew or Gallup, that's your like these gold standard polls, they used to be able to get 1 out of 5 people they would call who would actually take the survey. They'd go all the way through, they'd answer their phone, they'd say yes, and they'd answer all the questions and they'd complete, and that would be it. I will speak for our polling team now, but New York Times has exposed some of this too. You are lucky if you get a response rate of 1.5%. And when we're talking about the voters who we really start digging in on, and in this election, it's a lot of these so-called lower propensity voters, younger voters, voters of color, who are sort of bizarrely in some of these polls showing maybe an openness to voting for Trump, which I don't necessarily believe, but we can talk more about that. Their response rates are significantly lower, meaning you might have to call 1,000 of them to get 5 of them to take a survey. So then the question we have to ask ourselves is, are those 5 people representative of the other 995 people who they didn't have a phone number for, they weren't able to get a text survey through to? And so, as consumers of polls, we have to be a little bit more sophisticated and actually look at how the poll was conducted. Was it just landlines, which you generally wouldn't see nowadays? The New York Times surveys, which again are considered more of a gold standard poll, those are only conducted to cell phones. I teach at Howard University, and I'll ask my students in every semester, how many of you will answer a phone from an unknown number? And it's almost none of them. People just don't do that. So the kind of person who does, is that skewed? When our polling team polls, we do what we call as multi-mode, which means you're texting people, you're calling their cell phones, you're sending them online surveys, you're using online panels. And even when you do all of that, you're still going to have bias. So again, I'm sure we can talk more about that as we get into this conversation. But To me, that's the most important thing to remember. It's just really hard.
Yeah, I'm good at sliding delete, 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 delete.
Me too. Me
so
too.
Tim, I think people think, oh, well, you just take these numbers and they don't realize that there's a series of assumptions that go into polling as well. And that is, what does the electorate look like? And it's a lot of it is based on past performance. But if I think, this is my bias. I think that what got missed in 2016 was all the new voters who came. I mean, all of a sudden people were voting for Trump who hadn't voted before. And so we always talk about polling of likely voters. How we determine whether people's likely to vote, people are likely to vote is, have they voted before? And so I think, can you just explain a little bit about how pollsters think about the voting electorate and how they kind of, I wouldn't say adjust their data or manipulate their data, but they clearly make some assumptions on the front end. They just don't call 1,000 people and say, called 1,000 people today and this is what they said. And if they're doing that, they're not polling legitimate.
Yeah, you're right, because you have to model. I mean, to Tom's point, to the example that he was using, Tom, feel free to chime in if there's anything I miss on this, but because this is your bread and butter. But, if you call 1,000 people and 800 of the people that answer are over 55, because they're more likely to answer the phone calls, well, then you don't have a real electorate, because it's not going to be 80% 55 plus in the electorate. So then what do? Well, you end up modeling. Well, we know that the electorate should be about X percent, 18 to 30, or which should be about X percent non-college or black or white or whatever. And so then you take the results you do have and you weight it a certain way to kind of match the model. And that's how the polls end up. And that's why one of the 2016 misses, this is kind of shocking really, is that a lot of pollsters in 2016 weren't modeling based on education, and missed this huge education polarization that was happening in the country, where a lot of people that didn't go to college that had traditionally been Democrats were voting for Trump, and that were Republicans who went to college were voting for Hillary or Gary Johnson or Evan McMullen. And so their polls got really skewed because they kind of missed this one, they were modeling on the wrong kind of demographics that were more relevant to past campaigns. So it happens. Their polling misses. I will say to my fellow anti-Trump friends, my new friends from the Democratic side, a lot of my friends on the Mitt Romney campaign were convinced the polls were skewed in 2012, and I was the turd in the punch bowl in those meetings, being like, I don't think so. Actually, this seems right to me, and obviously Mitt Romney didn't end up winning. I feel that way a little bit now, because I think that polling is challenging. I agree with everything you guys are saying, but the 2022 polls did a pretty good job. There were a couple of misses. There's some groups that are being missed. I think it's still really tough to get Spanish speakers in certain states, and I think that makes the Nevada and Arizona polling tough. I think it's tough still in certain states. Like Maine was really tough to poll for various reasons. So I think there were some outliers, but directionally 2022 was pretty good. So I think anybody that's looking at this and is like, it's totally wrong, we're winning by 10, maybe, I hope, but I don't, that's not kind of my assumption here.
Yeah, well, even if you think you're winning by 10, you run like you're 10 behind. And that's always the assumption. So let's get into the horse race. Who's going to win the House? Anybody going to take that?
I'll take it. I feel like look, if Donald Trump wins this election with 300 electoral votes, he's going to have control of the entire Congress and the White House. Everybody just, start breathing into a paper bag or whatever you need to deal with that. But if it's a close presidential election, which is what I expect, because of various things having to do with redistricting, because of just the sheer number of Republicans that are in Biden districts right now, I'd give the Democrats a narrow advantage in the House. I don't think it's a slam dunk guarantee or anything, but I think the Democrats. I think Hakeem Jeffries is likely to be the speaker.
Yeah. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, I'm trying to quit making projections, which is difficult, especially when you're on Twitter. But I'm a
podcaster now, Tom. You have actual clients. I can make predictions.
Right, you have to. I'm going to leave it to you, and I'll just say I broadly agree. I mean, it's going to be close, which is the easy, safe thing to say. You look at the battleground. There are 8 effectively toss-up seats just between California and New York. It's where Democrats lost the House effectively. in the last election. It's where Democrats can win it back. There's one of those New York seats that should actually be a fairly easy pickup for Democrats because of redistricting. The rest of them are true toss-ups. There's the Alabama district that, because of the court decision, adding the new Democratic district in Alabama is a safe Democratic seat. We'll see what happens in Louisiana with the court decisions going back. You could have another one there. The margins are so narrow. In the end, Democrats still need to win probably about 2/3 of the toss-up seats, those that are currently considered toss-ups. But those are overwhelmingly, as Tim alluded to a second ago, those are overwhelmingly Biden seats. So there's no reason that they shouldn't be able to win them. But that's going to be the battleground.
Well, Biden performance and Biden turnout could make a huge difference. And I want to talk a little bit about, everybody thinks it's about the economy. I'm going to challenge that assumption a little bit. So let's go to the Senate. Senate map for Democrats, horrible. This is actually my cycle. These are, I lost in 18. Now they're up, but back in a presidential cycle. We've got some races out there that are tough. And we're going to talk a little bit about Tester's race later in the podcast or later in the summit here. But Sherrod Brown, I was just recently in Ohio and asked a group of CPA professionals how many thought Sherrod was going to get returned to the Senate. Very small minority of people raised their hand. I think they're seeing some tea leaves there that could be problematic. There isn't any, we could argue about whether Texas is in play. Allard's a great candidate, but we put our faith in Texas and Florida every cycle and just have our hopes dashed. And so give me a little sense of where you guys are looking at the Senate, what races you're watching that people may not be paying attention to. And we'll start with you, Tim.
Yeah, look, the Democrats, to keep the Senate, have to play perfect baseball for a second cycle in a row. And that's just a lot to ask, not to lose one coin flip race. It didn't happen in 2022, which beat my expectations. So, if you're a listener and want Democrats to do better, I did not expect. I expected it to be 50-50 or 49 good Democrats in 2022, and they ended up winning basically all the toss-up seats. You have to do that again. I don't really see that happening, especially in a presidential year where Ohio and Montana are in play, as you referenced. The rest of the map, I will say, Democrats are really outperforming Biden. So that's the funny part. Whenever you hear Democratic advocates complain about the polls, they never mention the Senate polls, which are looking really good. Those polls must be doing well because Democratic senators, Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, Tammy Baldwin, Ruben Gallego, all of them are outpolling Biden significantly. I'd look besides the two we mentioned, Michigan and Nevada are the two that would worry me the most if I was Democrats. Michigan is an open seat.
Michigan?
Yeah, I'm not sitting here predicting the Republicans, but the Republican candidates in that race are not quite as insane as they are in some of these other places. Slotkin's good. I like Slotkin, but doesn't have huge name ID. And then in Nevada, I just think Nevada demographically is moving towards Republicans, and Rosen, it doesn't have a particularly strong brand in the way that Baldwin and Casey do.
I wouldn't argue Nevada with you. I would not argue Nevada. I think Nevada, the economy has not recovered in Nevada. We saw some pretty discouraging numbers during the midterms. So, I just would not argue Nevada. But, I'm still holding out hope. I thought maybe you're going to say that because there's a large Muslim population, that may skew, some of those may not turn out.
Could be a problem.
Demographic would be a problem for her, for Lise.
Could be a problem for her. I'm not. I guess I'm just sitting here looking. I'm just saying, if I'm looking at the map right now, that's part of the reason that's so uncertain is just we don't have candidates yet. The primary is still happening. Yeah. So the Michigan's still a little bit uncertain.
Well, and I would say that you never know. If we were sitting here in 2012 and you said North Dakota, you guys go, yeah, right. It ain't happening. You just never know because candidates do matter. But this is against a trend that's been going on for a long time of nationalizing these Senate races. Kent Conrad and Byron Dorgan never ran and won in an election where a Democratic president won. We haven't elected North Dakota a Democratic president since Lyndon Johnson in 1964, but yet they were able to basically split ticket. Ticket splitting is just not kind of the norm anymore. And so that's why Biden's performance, in spite of polls, Biden's performance in the end will have a big effect. How much headwind people, let's say Biden doesn't do well in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, that headwind will have an effect on these Senate races. We don't know to what extent. Right? What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, to the extent that 2022 is instructive at all, it is this sort of formula of incumbents were strong, very strong in 2022, and Democrats won where Republicans nominated unqualified extremist candidates. But keeping in mind that some of those were very close, like Georgia especially. But the points that you both raised are well taken, that you do have the problem that this isn't 2022 and you have the presidential ticket at the top of the ticket. And you're right. All evidence suggests that ticket splitting is going to be lower than it's ever been. I agree with what Tim said. I think a lot of these races in the end, they look good. They look good in the polling, and I think they'll come through. I think either way, it's going to be a seat or two. You aren't going to see a big wave for one side, certainly not for Democrats, because the opportunities aren't there. Again, it would have to be Texas and or Florida, and I got to see something else to believe that. At this point.
Yeah, and we were coming fresh off the Dobbs decision in 2022, so everybody, women were energized to vote. Now there's been a bunch of decisions, whether it's the IVF decision, whether it is clever polling. I talked to the woman who won in Alabama, won a state house seat, or a Senate seat. I can't remember if she's in the Senate or House, and she ran right at choice, and overwhelmingly, she had lost that district in a previous election by maybe 5-6 points, and won in the special election by 10. And so, I think, again, the question going back to what is going to be the issue, if you said it's the economy, I would say, no, it's not. I think it's immigration and abortion, and whatever angers people the most on that day is going to be who decides the election.
Well, and if I can say, on the abortion issue, I think in 2022, we saw this arc that we'll all remember, but just to remind people, where the Dobbs decision happened, June 24th, the Kansas election happened that surprised a lot of people. Not necessarily that the pro-abortion rights no vote won, but that won by 17 points in such a red state. Obviously, Kansas isn't, the reason they're moderate Republicans there still. So, and then, a month later, people calibrated to, this is going to change everything. And then it was after Labor Day, there were some bad polls that were suggesting that immigration, crime, and inflation were the top issues. And everyone said, well, Democrats overplayed their hands on the issue. And in the end, what we saw, Nate Cohn from the New York Times, who's a pretty smart analyst on these things, he said after the election that their polling miss, where they looked at their polls and said, look, abortion is fading as an issue. It's going to be inflation. He said that was a bigger miss than their polling misses in the horse race and the Clinton-Trump race in 2016.
Wow.
In terms of what was in voters' heads. I believe abortion will still be incredibly salient, but the problem for Democrats, progressive, and abortion rights supporters is, how do you draw the connection between voting for a Democratic senator or Democratic House candidate and protecting abortion rights? And we haven't seen evidence of that yet. We saw it in Michigan 2022 because it was on the ballot. We've seen it in these states where it is on the ballot. It's mobilizing these voters to come out. It has been harder, and you offer a great example of that Alabama special election. Problem is, does that have any notable effect in a presidential election where turnout's already going to be high? Florida's got it on the ballot. Arizona looks like we'll have it on the ballot. I think that, would have an impact. I will say, just last thing, on Florida, even though I wouldn't look at that and say, we should be investing a lot or counting on that Senate race, I'm also not as down on Florida as most people are.
She's a great candidate.
Yeah, great candidate. You have the ballot initiative there. You also have cannabis on the ballot there. And what happened 2 years ago, which is why everyone, I think, is especially sour, because DeSantis just won so easily. The Senate race wasn't close either. Democrats just didn't show up in that election. It wasn't like there was a huge swing. Yes, the state is becoming redder, but Democrat turnout was the worst it's been in generations. There's no reason to believe that it'll be the same this time around. Again, I'm not predicting anything. I'm just saying I don't think it's quite as bad as everyone seems to be thinking. Will it be good enough? I wouldn't bet on that either.
Yeah, I do want to make this point that as we talk today, Chuck Schumer has put contraception, for which he couldn't get anything other than 2 Republican votes, and they're mad about that, right? Because that's what we call, a gotcha vote. And he put the gotcha vote on, and people are saying, well, contraception's protected, but that's not going to be an argument that people are going to listen to, because they used to think that abortion was protected. And they knew that abortion was on the ballot. So, Tim, you wanted to weigh in on.
Well, I was just going to go back to the House really quick on abortion, because I do, Tom. I don't have a ton of actual data to back this up, Tom. So this is back into my podcasting and vibe space. But look, if you look at the midterms in the states where the abortion issue, I think for good reason, maybe didn't seem as salient because they're in blue states. Like, the Democrats didn't do as well. Right, in New York, in California, I think it's reasonable that maybe you might think that, man, crime is a more salient issue for me right now in New York. Abortion rights aren't going anywhere in New York. That sucks for the people in Alabama. I'm mad about it. I'm a feminist. I'm pro-choice, but I'm voting about safety in my community. That's different in a 2024 election if the Democrats can make the case that if these guys win full control of Congress and Trump is the president, abortion rights are conceivably at risk everywhere. That is part of my calculus on why I think that the Democrats have a little bit more favorable House map this time. I'm not sure how much that helps in a lot of these Senate places.
I couldn't agree more. I think that was exactly the dynamic in 2022. I've tried to, being the data nerd that I am, come up with a formula for predicting where abortion rights would have more of an impact, or did. And it's really 2 things. It's perception of risk and perception of opportunity. In New York and California, as I say, they didn't see the risk. In places like Florida, they just didn't see the opportunity. They didn't believe that those races were going to be, or Texas as well, that their vote would actually contribute to winning. And you're right. Trump is trying to moderate on the issue, but in the end, it's not just about, I think for a lot of people, it's not just about will he or won't he enact a federal ban. But it's, will he act decisively to restore the rights of Roe? And the answer to that is no.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's now dodging on there. It should be a states' rights issue, which, that he's not getting punished from the right for taking that position. But I think I think one thing has happened that will have a effect. You think about Newt Gingrich and the contract for America. We used to call it the contract on America. You think about Paul Ryan and his budget and what effect that had on the Romney campaign. And I think it did, because it had, substantial cost savings, you could argue that way, or cuts in Medicare and Social Security. And then you had the Romney thing saying they're takers, not givers. And so it played into that kind of elite, we don't care kind of thing. And now you've got the 2025 project. And the 2025 project is real. I mean, it is, you've got Trump basically asking the oil industry, give me $1 billion. And then there's a report saying they're lining up with executive orders, right, for the oil industry to reverse some of the climate work that Trump's done, or that Biden has done. And so there for people who can make, kind of a door-to-door argument, voter to voter, and no, this is a climate voter. This is a choice voter. And as much as Trump's trying to hide some of that and broaden his appeal to be just, I'm not Biden, he's going to be hung with 2025. What do you guys think? Think I'm overstating that, or you think that's a real possibility?
I think that Trump's I think it's the biggest example of Trump being distracted by all his trials. A sharper Trump would not have let himself be saddled with this. I don't know why he's letting himself be saddled with this. He had no platform in 2020. There was a reason for that.
That's the point that I was going to make, Tim, is that he avoided all of this at the convention. Now he's hung with 2025.
Yeah, and it's crazier than what the platform people would put forth in a lot of ways, because it's like the most extreme nerd in every vertical at the Heritage Foundation is writing their own, wish list. So I think it's a big problem for him, for sure.
Well,
It's all right
it's-
though. They took it off their website, so it doesn't exist anymore.
It's a big problem if the Democrats capitalize on it.
For sure.
People would say, and how did I win in 2012? People say, well, you said you're going to vote for Obama. Well, I said, yeah, I was going to vote for Obama, and I had a poster that I carried around, and it had all the things in the Ryan budget, right? And Ryan was the running mate, and I said, I don't agree with Obama on Keystone. I don't agree on this. I don't agree on that. But this is really bad. And it had huge farm program cuts. And so I could go through and make the argument that Romney because Romney had endorsed it, right? That Romney and Ryan were going to do things that people in North Dakota didn't want them to do. And so I think this 2025 project is if it's utilized right politically, is very damaging to Trump.
Well, and speaking of a national abortion ban, the Comstock Act, that's a part of this Project 2025, is they say, look, we don't need to pass anything legislatively. They've realized after getting beaten badly in places like Kansas and Ohio and Michigan and elsewhere that they're not going to win at the ballot. And so they have to find a different path, and they look at it and they see this Comstock Act, or acts, which are more than a century old, that, hey, we just need a Department of Justice that will enforce this, because these are laws that are on the books that they believe now because of Dobbs are enforceable. And, that at some point would seem far-fetched, but now you've seen what Arizona and other states have done where they are enforcing laws from that same time period. It shouldn't be implausible to anyone. And so can Democrats get this out in the forefront? It's still a little bit esoteric, but yeah, I believe that can resonate if we're repeating it enough.
Okay, so we could talk all day, but we've got to turn to the presidential. I queued this up because I think a lot of people don't want to, as a discussion about polling, because I think a lot of people think the polling's off, or Biden says that's not true. And I'm like, well, then why are you issuing executive orders on the border? Why did you agree to debate? So there's indications that the Biden people think that current polling in swing states is correct. So how, if I'm a Biden supporter who's watching this, tell me, number one, what the argument should be for not trusting these polls. And number two, you guys have both been involved in campaigns for a long, long time. What's the three things you would tell Biden to do, right? The Biden team to do right now that you think could plateau this trajectory or build momentum for Biden?
Tom, you want to go first? You want me to take it?
It's yours. That's all yours.
All right. I do trust the polls, so sorry. I mean, I don't trust every single exact poll, but directionally speaking, I think it's about a tied race right now. And I think that a big reason for that is, and this might be the area where the polls are a little bit off, is what Tom referenced in that very first answer, which is less engaged voters in the traditional Democratic coalition. And, in 2020, I felt like my people, the former Republicans, college-educated, suburban Republicans in Atlanta, were super important. And I think we're important again because Biden's got to keep my people in the coalition. But that group is pretty solid from 2020. There's a little bit of bleed, maybe just on the edges, but it's pretty consistent. And I think there's potential room to grow there. We can talk about. But the group that he's down with is Black and Latino men mostly that don't have college attainment, and young voters across the board. And so. Okay, so like once you know that, then the question is, how do you deal with these people? I think the first instinct of some people is to be like, well, he's got to do something about Gaza because these got to be really left people. No, like that's not true. He is struggling with the really left young people, but these other groups, a lot of them are kind of either not apolitical, non-political, independent, heterodox, like, I don't calling them centrist is weird because they're not like Heidi Heitkamp centrists. They're just kind of like, they have a weird mix of views, and they don't watch the news that much. They get all their news from TikTok and social media. So how do you engage them? Well, I mean, like Biden campaign has to run an actual effort to talk to them and to speak to them about issues that they care about. And we got to scare the shit out of them. about Donald Trump. I mean, like, that's really the reality, because they are not, that group is not gonna be posting Joe Biden memes by November. You know, they're not like gettable like Biden super fans. Like the Biden campaign needs to demonstrate that they care
They're
about
not
them.
going to put a T-shirt on.
They're not
That's
putting
what I
on a
was saying.
T-shirt.
Are these T-shirt wearers?
No, not T-shirt wearers. They got to believe that Biden actually cares about the things they care about, and they got to be scared to death of Donald Trump. And so that's not the most uplifting campaign, but that's the reality of, I think. And then, you know, I think that going back to the other group I was talking about, these kind of suburban Mitt Romney voting former Republican types, I think there's still a little bit of meat on that bone. And I think Biden's already doing a pretty good job of speaking to them. And I think that the thing that he could do the best from here on out is do a full court press on getting validators that can speak to them. Romney, Liz Cheney, Christie, Kelly, Mattis, Tillerson, like as many of those people as possible I want at the convention to try to like nudge over, you know, the last 1% of these suburban former Republican types that really don't like Trump already. So those would be my that'd be my advice for the Biden campaign.
What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, I think that's all right. I think if I can start on the polling just real quick, because I have my pet peeves there. I'm not saying the polling is wrong. I think it is right, and I do think this race truly is a very close race. That it's, you know, within a point or two either way. A couple things I just want to note on that, though, that I think the caveats that aren't reflected in how we're talking about this race. In 2022, Tim talked about how generally the consensus is that the polls were actually pretty good, and historically that holds up. The average error in the Senate polling in 2022 is 4.9 points. The average error in the presidential polling in 2016 was 5.0 points. We think of 2016 as this massive failure, and we think of 2022 as pretty good. Well, part of that is Senate polling's harder. There's less of it. It tends to be less accurate, so we're grading on a curve. But the reality is, it's reasonable to assume that the average error will be somewhere around 5 points in these polls. Could be more, could be less. The primary polling, which actually is correlated with general election polling error, has not been great. So will that portend a bigger error? Possibly. That's what it has meant in the past. So we're not treating these polls. We're still treating these polls as if they're laser accurate, and this is exactly where the race stands. And for all the reasons we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, it's not there. We have to kind of build in 5 or 6 points either way. And if you do that, it's a shoulder shrug. We don't know where this stands other than it's going to be a close race, which I think is the safest thing. Then the other question is, as Tim got into, it's a question of turnout. And I know that's trite. It's always about turnout. But in this case, it's really weird because these lowest turnout, generally Democratic constituencies are polling much better for Trump. The reason why I'm not as concerned about that is just general math on turnout. In 2020, 161 million Americans voted because the stakes were high, because people were very fired up, because of a lot of issues, and because we had the greatest liberalization of voting access that this country has seen in over a century. A lot of states have gone back. People don't feel super fired up about these candidates for the most part. There's no reason to believe that. Hot take here. I don't see turnout coming anywhere near to that 161 million. So if I'm the campaign, a lot of people have said this, if I'm the campaign that is relying on turnout from people who didn't vote in the highest turnout election in a century, I'm not feeling great about that. I do think when we talk about what the campaigns need to do, I agree with everything Tim said. I think that's all right. I do think that the Biden debate strategy was a smart one for that reason, in that if the area where he is struggling is with these voters who generally just aren't paying attention and need to be reminded that Trump truly poses an existential threat in many ways, then how do you get on their radar? Because, and look, it is actually natural and probably very healthy for these people to not be paying attention to this race now. Like it's not the healthiest thing that we're all here talking about it, but I can't stop. And so
you do make your living in campaigning.
I do. And so, yeah, I'm undermining my own livelihood here. But but the reality is, by things like in the debate by itself, they're not going to tune in and watch the debate, by the way, in June. But will this influence the general public discourse? Yes. Will it impact the coverage? Yes. That's a big thing where Democrats are just currently losing. Like where these people are getting information from, it is just overwhelmingly negative to Biden. And so if they can start to turn that around and turn around earlier, I think it's positive for them.
Well, and you know, the State of the Union gave people some breathing space, you know, as the Biden campaign calls some of us bedwetters, you know, people who worry
Fair.
about, you know, how what's happening. And so everybody's like, and I call them breath holders, like, oh, good. Oh, good. You know,
That's a much nicer way to put it. And I will say, like, I understand. I don't hold it against. The stakes are truly so high that anyone who cares about this election in any way for either side, if you aren't at least somewhat concerned, because in the end, either candidate could win it quite easily. It is.
So I want to make this point, and it frustrates me. During the primary season, I did a lot of commentary for, you know, both CNBC and ABC. And I always made the point, look, you have to look at Trump in the primary as the incumbent president, right? And Nikki Haley was polling and still is polling in primaries at 15, 16, 17%. She was polling as high as 40. Trump was only getting 60. And the headline from the media was Trump overwhelmingly wins. And I'm like, no, that is not how you need to look at this. And I will tell you, you know, in North Dakota, as red can be, right after the 2020 election, you know, we were still in COVID. I was riding my bike around town. You know, I live right on the Missouri River, tons of Trump flags, you know, about stolen elections or whatever. You don't see that level of enthusiasm for Donald Trump. I mean, no one's talking about, you know, like the old boat parade kind of analysis. And so, you know, I think, are people, you know, wearing T-shirts for Joe Biden? No, not a lot of people are putting those on. But, you know, other than the deep MAGA community, you don't see the red hats as much either. I mean, comment on that.
Well, it's like season 7 of the reality show. You know what I mean? Like, so you might still be watching it. You know, my husband used to work for Heidi. He's a big Grey's Anatomy fan. They're on like season 30. You know, it used to be he watched it when it came on Thursday night. Now he's kind of like, oh, I'll catch up when I get to it. You know, and like there's a little bit of that, right? There's a wear on just the excitement of this stuff. So I do think that's true. I think that the Trump, even like, you know, I had real concerns about security risks around the court dates and stuff. And there could still be one-off issues, and I think there's still real threats. But you didn't see like huge groups gathered outside the courthouse, you know, or protesting outside Judge Merchan's house. And thank God, right? But like those could have been signs that the excitement around this guy is like a little diminished, even among the craziest people. So I think that's true. My only caveat on the primaries is I was a little less excited than everybody because a big reason that Democrats have done so well in the midterms, not the only reason, I'm not this solipsistic, but a big reason that they did well in the midterms, well in special elections, was like these same people that turned up to vote for Nikki Haley, right? It was like in my head, like the never Trump voting former Republican is like my friends' wives, you know, they're the school, they're the mom, they're the class mom, you know, they know when the special election is. They used to be a Republican, they were a moderate Republican, but now they are so scared, hate Trump, and you know, went fully woke, and like now they're Democrats and they're voting for Pete or Amy in the primary, and like they freaking vote every time. Like the people that have left the Republican Party and gone to be part of the Biden coalition are reliable voters, and they're reliable enough to show up and vote for Nikki Haley as an FU to Donald Trump. And so like when I look at that number, I'm just like, is this number for Nikki Haley just a number that represents enthusiasm among that small cohort of Trump haters, or is it a broader message of dissatisfaction with him within the party? And I just don't, you know, we don't know. Like we don't have a political scientist experiment to know.
So your thinking there is that they hate Trump so bad they went to the Republican primary to vote against him.
Yeah. Yeah, they were Republicans their whole lives, and then they switched
and that
parties.
we shouldn't think that those were Trump voters in 2020 in 2020. They were Biden voters, but they stayed registered as Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's some. It's not all, but the question is how much, and that's a big, that matters a lot, right? If that's like a third of that group, that's a great sign for Biden. There was 2/3 of that group. It's not as good of a sign.
There's that Emerson poll. Emerson poll released today, and I'm going to break one of my rules on sample size. But when you look at the polls consistently, the partisans are still pretty polarized. Trump's winning about 10% of self-identified Democrats. Biden's winning, 4 to 5% of self-identified Republicans. So Trump's doing better, which he obviously needs to do. But they had a question on primary vote. And among the people who said that they voted for Nikki Haley, they're about 50-50 between the two candidates. So it says, just doing the math between those two, exactly as you said, these are not people who are still self-identifying as Republicans overwhelmingly. They're voting and, and two sides of the coin. I mean, it is one of the bigger problems. Forever we talked about how Republicans had a more durable coalition because they had the people who would come out in these lower turnout midterm elections, and that's how they were able to build their majority. So, it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing for Democrats.
It's good for the Democrats.
It
was a good trade. Like you picked up these very conscientious voting people, and then you lost people that are way less conscientious. Non-college working class guys who sometimes vote, sometimes don't. Okay, but how do the numbers work out on that trade in a presidential election with Trump on the ballot, right? That's different. It was a good trade for midterms. I think TBD about generals.
Exactly.
Okay, so the question of the hour is, how do you see the conviction in New York affecting the presidential race?
I think it helps Biden. I mean, you've seen the Nate Cohn poll, which is the most rigorous thing we've seen so far. They went back and talked to the same 2,000 people they already talked to, and 2% moved in Biden's favor. So again, Tom can give all the caveats about this, about how rigorous that is, but that's telling because that's real people. That's not sampling error, that's not modeling. There were 2,000 people that said that they were Trump +3, and then the same 2,000 people Trump +1. I think that's a good sign that there's a nudge in Biden's direction. And I think it helps with these low propensity people we're talking about. If you're not paying attention, you don't know who Judge Merchan is. You don't know who Michael Cohen is even.
And you go,
guilty.
Do I really want that?
Do I really want that? Right. I think that there's on the margins. I think that's helpful.
Yeah. Well, you don't think it helps. I mean, the Trump people and the Republicans are arguing it helps Trump.
It's idiotic.
I think it helps them raise.
Yeah, it helps them raise money.
Yeah,
but that's it.
Everything else is moronic. To pay his legal bills.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm having all the fun, and we do have listeners who have sent us questions, and so I have to now stop my fun. But some of these are great questions. I have a question from a Facebook listener. Having lived through the 2024 Republican Iowa caucus, and now with a few months until the election, we don't see the Trump shrines or flags that we saw in 2016 to around 2021, 22. And that's the question that I asked. Is this wishful thinking? But those of us who live in red places are not seeing it. They're not flying the flags.
I've heard that too. Yeah, I've heard that too. Shrines is an interesting word.
I know.
It's appropriate.
Word.
It's appropriate. I live in a rare red enclave in central Maryland. So people, obviously Maryland is a very blue state. My neighbors are cornfields. So, and you're not seeing that here either. We've seen that with the rallies. They're doing the same thing that they did all along, but the reality was he was having much more intensity and enthusiasm. They were trying to play up the New Jersey rally, then the Bronx rally.
Yeah.
And then you get the actual stats on the crowds, and it's not super impressive. So yeah, you're not seeing that same energy. Again, most Americans didn't want to see this rematch.
Well, yeah, I think that's fair to say. And the other thing is, I guess he never said lock her up. Who knew? Who knew? This is another great question, and it's more on topic on rural America. Rural voters feel distrust in big business and the wealthy. Then how do they justify supporting the GOP when they're really owned by the same corporations.
Well, look, I don't live I live in New Orleans, so I live in a red state. I'm the inverse of Tom, but I've got red all around me and spend a lot of time, going to visit people other parts of the state. Look, this is cultural, and it's culture war all the way down is the thing. And my one message to this group, I'm so supportive of the mission of this group, and I was appreciative to be invited. My one message is I get called often from like moderate type people. Maybe they're moderate Democrats, maybe they're former Republicans, maybe they're just independent business people, and they're like, I want to run. What do I want to do? I want to run in a red state, a red area. And like my first question always is like, what is a cultural issue that you agree with Donald Trump on? And they like get very uncomfortable at that question, right? Because even if there is one, they kind of don't want to say it. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't mean you have to be a jerk like him, but like immigration, trans issues, whatever. Like you name it. I'm by the way, I'm against Donald Trump on all these issues. This is why I've switched teams. But if we just want to be real, like the culture is a big part of this, and I think that the Democrats would benefit from having a little bit more latitude in bringing in people that have different cultural mores than kind of the dominant urban cultural more. I say this during Pride Month, so like a lightning bolt's going to strike me down right now. But like it's some different cultural mores, I think is what Democrats, it would maybe help then get people to listen to that person's point. You know what I mean? If they felt like the person they were hearing from was not some elite that looks down on them, then they start listening. And they're like, oh wait, you're making some good points here about the corporations and about the economic populism.
So here's two issues that I think, for me, just progressives hate me on. Number one is support of an energy policy that keeps energy prices low, which means we have to figure out how to make natural gas carbon neutral, right? But they hate natural gas, hate anything that comes out of the ground, right? It's got to be, that kind of power that they believe is, and I'm like, good luck with that, because you're not going to achieve climate goals in that theory. And so, but they don't want to engage because the knee jerk is there. Another issue is when you look at demographics in this country right now, guess who's succeeding? Women are succeeding. And for years in the feminist movement, we've talked about women having education opportunities, workforce opportunities. I don't think the workforce is there. I think we still have a lot of work to do. But when you look at that cohort of young people and you realize men are being left behind, and the Republicans are saying it's because we don't have enough trad wives or whatever crazy kind of fix they're going to have, instead of saying our education system now is dominated by women teachers who want people to sit down and shut up. And maybe that's not how boys learn. I mean, historically.
Okay, there we go. Now you're onto a culture issue. I like that. Right, I'm with you. Yeah, I agree with
I'm saying find that issue that is true. That you can look at data, any data cruncher would look at it and say, this is a problem. And they're right. There is something going on in our education system that's not speaking to boys. They're not going to college at the same level. The academic achievement isn't the same level. They don't seem to have the same level of ambition that they did 20 years ago to succeed. How do we fix that? Instead of saying, oh, that's against feminism. Well, no, it's not. We're mothers. We want our boys to succeed, right? Yeah. And so to your point, Tim, find those issues. And you can't, if you look at the Republican Party and what Donald Trump did, Donald Trump used trade and the trade agreements to basically siphon off historic Democratic groups, blue collar. Yeah. When I started in politics, who is my base?
Union guys.
Yeah, union guys.
Cool guys.
Small farmers, elderly, who still understood that Medicare and Medicaid weren't secure, and blue collar workers.
Yeah.
And why did they walk away from us? And you can say, well, look, the Republican policies are wrong. But you know what? When somebody walks away from the conversation with you, you got to look at what you're saying to them. Right?
I agree with that. Yes. Totally agree.
Yeah. So I mean, I think when, if Biden's whole thing with the border, man, could have come sooner. And I know that it's angering people, but it's a problem. And when people see pictures of it and it's there and they say nothing to see here, well, thinking, yeah, there is something to see here, and what are you going to do about it? And so, the hand wringing where people say, oh, all these rural voters, they vote against their interests. No, they don't. People never vote against their interests. You just haven't identified what their interest is.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right? Sometimes, but maybe they're thinking about the wrong interests a different way that you're thinking about it.
Yeah, but goes back to what you're saying about cultural issues.
Yeah,
and some of it isn't even the issue itself. It's that you're judging me because I don't want somebody who was born who basically was gender identified as a male to compete in women's sports, and you somehow have made me an evil person for thinking that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, and that's
this
tough.
is a complicated issue, and I think what's happening to trans people is just absolutely horrible.
Yeah,
and needs to be fixed, hopefully by the courts. But who knows? But don't judge people because they can't say they.
Right. Right.
It doesn't quite roll off the tongue.
Speech policing, speech policing is not helping in these areas. So it might seem frivolous. It's just reality.
Yeah. So let's just have one last. I'm looking at the time. We've got about 15 minutes left to kind of think about expectations in the next couple months here. And so I want to talk about the debates. And, whether there's a lot of kind of speculation out there that Biden's team did a great job negotiating a pretty good deal. And I want to close talking about third party and what maybe Bobby Kennedy Jr. how he will factor in. But let's first talk about the debates. What's your sense? I mean, you already said you think people won't necessarily watch them, but they'll watch the coverage of them. I think these debates are going to be heavily watched. More than what people think.
I agree. I think people will watch it. I don't think these lower propensity voters who have been identified as one of the key groups, I think rightfully or potentially, will be tuning into them. But I do think in terms of the likelihood, and again, we're talking about 140, maybe 150 million people are going to vote in this election. I think a large number of them will see at least some portion of the debate, whether it's watching it live or watching the clips. I do think it was a smart move by the Biden campaign. I do think, as you alluded to earlier, it's sort of an acknowledgement that they have work to do. Which again is not, I think we need to give the Biden campaign credit because they have been underestimated consistently. Just going back to the primaries, where remember in the Democratic primary in 2020, 2019, 2020, they came into it and they said, this is how we're going to win. We're not going to do well in Iowa. We're not going to do well in New Hampshire. But when it gets to South Carolina and Nevada, we're going to win because, that's an electorate that looks more like the Democratic Party. Everyone at the time said, yeah, that makes sense. Reasonable path. And then he loses Iowa and New Hampshire and it's panic. What a failure. And then, of course, he did what he did in South Carolina and Nevada, and he went on and he did exactly what the campaign said they were going to do. It's not a campaign that chases its tail. It's a campaign that quietly just lays out a strategy. I think the media wants them to admit on the record that they believe that they could lose or that the polling shows that they're losing, which is a sort of odd obsession with everyone in the media now. Why would, even if that's truly what they believe, if that's what their internal polls believe, their concern is not being ahead today. Their concern is the plan that they've laid out a viable plan to be ahead on election day? And I believe they do have a very solid plan. And I think them doing what they did with the debates was a big part of that. It was a smart move, and it will begin to remind people. The more that Trump is out there, the better things are for Joe Biden. We want him on TV more. We want him talking more. We want him. And we've seen this, especially since the conviction last week. He seems less and less coherent. And how could this not rattle someone? He is a human. How could it not rattle someone? He doesn't seem to be dealing with it well. So anything that puts him out in the public eye more, I think, is good for the Biden campaign.
And I've seen some analysis from swing voters that they are somewhat sympathetic on the conviction. But if you think about it, he was doing, and we all agree, I think all three of us agree that the polls are not, they're not completely wrong. And so, but he was gagged. I mean, he wasn't out there doing all this campaigning. And I think that having him now able to get out there, I mean, by Donald Trump, I think that that's going to help the Biden campaign.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, look, I think the debate we've made it this far without talking about Joe Biden's being aged, which is pretty good for one of these convos, 53 minutes. But like, I think that he had to do it because of that. Like, frankly, a big question, and every focus group in every poll is still, is he up for it? And it's like the best opportunity to demonstrate it. And if you're seen as hiding from the debates, it's only going to exacerbate that problem. So I from the start, there were some people that were like, Biden isn't going to debate or shouldn't debate. I knew he had to debate from the beginning. And to date, knock on wood, in like all these situations, he always seems to overperform, and Trump helps him with this by talking about how he's dead, has dementia, and it's weekend and Bernie's and stuff. They do, which is not the traditional messaging strategy. As an old media guy, you try to raise expectations for opponents traditionally, but so that's worked out in Biden's favor.
I was going to say, keep doing that. And then they have to argue that he was on some kind of stimulants,
drugs.
right?
Yeah, he's on drugs.
That's the argument.
So yeah. No, I was just gonna say really quick. The only other thing to Tom's thing about how the media wants the Biden team to admit that they are could lose or whatever. I don't need that. But I think the one fair critique from the bedwetting caucus is like, we could use about 20% more urgency. I could just use a little more urgency. I mean, just given the stakes of the deal, it's not Bob Dole on the other side there, and at times the campaign feels a little sleepy.
Lethargic, and unwilling to react, and then what could happen is when they react, they look like they're panicked, and that's the last thing you want to look like in a campaign.
Yeah, that's true.
You want to say,
I just want more is more. Just more Biden, more everything. More Biden, more Kamala, more ads, more trolling, more everything.
He's done 2 long forms this week, which I love, as long as he doesn't go to the New York Times because they're so hurt about it. But
he's got Mirror today. I saw some clips on, so I guess he's on ABC tonight, which is good.
Yeah.
The reality is that we are a long way from this election, and I think all three of us would agree that this is an election, and it's true. I mean, it just is such a stupid thing to say it's about turnout, but this is about turnout, and it's about who's going to be enthusiastic. And Tim thinks that fear has to be a huge big motivation factor for people to go out and vote. I think that what's interesting is the states that he has to win, the Rust Belt, right? Mm-hmm. We have very strong Senate candidates, and I've been arguing that our Senate candidates could have some level of coattail for Biden, right? People being enthusiastic about Tammy Baldwin, people being enthusiastic about Slotkin, people being enthusiastic about Bob Casey, those 3 states. And then you've got the crazy woman, Carrie Lake in Arizona, who isn't going to do them any favors. And we haven't even touched this, but if you go back and you take a look at how Trump says, don't trust mail-in voting. If I were a Republican Senate candidate, I would want to strangle him every time he says that, because that's what they were better on the doors, as we say in North Dakota, the doors. They're better on the doors because they were campaigning door to door during COVID when Biden wasn't, right, in 2020, and the Democrats weren't. And I think that hurt the Democrats. So this time there's going to be equal mobilization at the doors, knocking. Biden has plenty of money to engage. We're having trouble finding workforce, but the idea that Republicans have, and that Trump has, I shouldn't say Republicans, that mail-in voting is somehow an anathema to democracy, hurts the Republican Senate candidates, House candidates, gubernatorial candidates, and I think that it's something we're not talking enough about.
I love it. You look at Pennsylvania, Biden won, I think, 72% of mail ballots in Pennsylvania because of exactly what you said. And that was for the longest time, and I'm sure Tim can back this up. it was I can say from the Democratic side, it was something that we envied, was the Republican Party's ability to get their voters out by mail, bank them early. There's a huge tactical advantage to that, especially in places like Florida and Arizona. And the fact that, and Republicans have invested in this. We saw in the Virginia governor's race, the Virginia state legislative elections last year, they invested millions in it, and they actually did get better turnout from their voters. So there are efforts to do that this time around, but it's hard. It's hard.
One
So
other
it
little
certainly
gift.
puts them behind the eight
One other
ball.
little gift. If you're a strategist or a state senator listening to this, and you're in a red district, you're trying to figure out what Republicans might be gettable for me. They've now given you just a huge key. If you look at the Republicans who requested mail-in ballots, they're the rational ones. All right. We don't know for sure if they're gettable for Democrats,
so
but
true.
now like you have a target universe. Like they've self-separated just based on the way they vote between MAGA and somewhat in touch with reality. So that's a nice gift for Democratic candidates.
It just shows a lack of self-awareness, stop the steal. Well, you're the one who failed to deliver the votes. And this is, I mean, in North Dakota, we've had no reason, we could vote absentee without reason. We open up polling places. People love it. I mean, we don't know if there's going to be a snowstorm, right? And voting early at a polling place is completely available to people in North Dakota. They drive around, get groceries, go vote. And it means, though, that if you're waiting for election day for some October surprise, guess what? That whole theory of October surprise, poof, in states that have expanded mail voting and early voting. So, well, listen, you guys have been a lot of fun. I'm not going to hold you to any of the predictions, but I do think that, Tim, probably the most important thing that you said here is, if you're a red state Democrat, find things that you can actually agree on, that your common sense tells you this is a concern, this is a real problem. And, and don't feel like you need to carry the banner or the flag. They're busy doing that. They're busy all these people, because they're going to be standing with Trump. They want Trump's endorsement. They're stuck with 2025 now. You don't have to be stuck with Biden's agenda. You can do whatever you think you need to do that you believe in. Don't go pandering, but recognize that the Biden agenda isn't 100% right in everything.
Amen. We need more Heidis. So Tom is expensive out there. So I do take free calls. I do one free session with red district Democrats who want to call me. So if anybody are out there,
I do not do that.
From Tom. Yeah, Tom didn't do that. Tom's billing by the hour over there. But I'll funnel you through to him if I feel like there's a chance.
You know what would be fun is after the election, if the three of us could get together and just kind of like, miss that. We were right about that.
I'd love that.
Yeah. Thanks so much, you guys, for joining us. Thanks so much for being part of the Rural Progress Summit. It was just such an enjoyable conversation for me. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.